Good evening, everyone. I am so excited about the Nintendo Switch 2. New games, new controllers, a price hike exclusive to the West. Minasan konbawa. Gaming is a very expensive hobby. Just thinking about the GameCube will force you to take out a mortgage. There are numerous costs that go into the release of a single video game. You of course have to pay the game's developers, artists, and all the other staff that worked on the game itself. Then there's the marketing, gotta make sure people know your product is coming out. Then you have to pay to actually manufacture the game, its packaging. If you're including anything in the box, that's gonna cost you too. There's also the cost of shipping, paying the suits who oversaw the game, any royalties paid after the fact, and after all that, there's not even a guarantee that it's a game that's gonna sell. Imagine being that poor accountant at Nintendo forced to work on everybody 1-2 Switch. I hope they like spit. Every video game that makes it to store shelves has a small army behind it to get it there, and all those people usually like to get paid, and at a certain point, they have to put a price to the product. But these games don't exist within their own little bubble. They're sitting side by side with dozens, if not hundreds of products on the shelf, and if the newest Mario is $50, you don't want to be charging $70 for your basic-ass soccer game. And yet, sometimes a game or entire company will randomly decide that they're better than everyone else, causing every other company to mark up their products to show everyone else that they're just as premium as the other guys. The price of a product is just as much a part of the marketing as the box art or commercials. You can have the best graphics, gameplay, and music, but if the game's $90, nobody's gonna buy it. The standard for the longest time was 60 smackaroos for a standard AAA game, but it wasn't always like that. Game prices have been fluctuating since the beginning, and to see how consumers have been getting scammed since the dawn of time, we need to go back to the very beginning. Oh. The Magnavox Odyssey was the first commercially available console to the public in 1972, with the games costing $5.49 or about $40 adjusted for inflation. That seems fairly reasonable until you look at the games you were paying for, and being the first game console, ever, the games were a bit less graphically intense. The Odyssey was only able to display 2 boxes in a line, so they had to get a bit creative, including screen overlays to give you some sort of idea of what you're looking at, which added to the production costs while also serving as the very first peripheral. This may seem expensive given that the games are this, but this was the first time anyone had to think about this. Plus, what came after made Magnavox look like saints. Crack open any Bible, you'll see their name. The Odyssey technically didn't have cartridges, rather they were boards that you were swapping out to change how the console itself functioned. But moving on to the first generation, they just made it so that you couldn't change the games. Magnavox ended up selling the Odyssey's games as individual Pong consoles from $100 to $230, over $1,000 in today's money. Oh my god, this is insane! Why on earth would any conscious taxpayer even pay this much for games this simple? Especially when shortly after, Atari themselves stepped in and could use the actual Pong license, considering that they made the game. It's not even like there was a price advantage with Odyssey. Atari's home Pong series was under $100, $580 in today's cash, and were better iterations of the game. While not the sole reason Magnavox didn't survive much longer, the overpricing of their Pong consoles definitely was one of the reasons. Aside from Atari's jump into the home, Coleco and Nintendo both threw their hat into the ring, both essentially being newcomers to the industry. While Atari sold a solid 15,000 units, after looking at the other two's performance, Coleco sold 1 million units and Nintendo sold 3 million, more than 10 times Atari, and it all came down to one thing. You didn't have to take out a loan to buy them. Coleco's units were $50 and Nintendo got as low as $36, today being worth about $280 and $200 respectively. When your competition is essentially the exact same thing but more expensive, why wouldn't you go for the cheaper option? It's not like there were any reasons to pick one console up over the other at this time. This was essentially the exact same product. It wasn't until the Atari 2600 hit the scene in 1977 that we started to see the cost of games start to mellow out. While the Odyssey did technically have multiple games, all those games were almost all iterations on the same idea. The 2600 on the other hand was able to have vastly different games, which is also where the introduction of the video game cartridge came in. The standard price for a 2600 game was anywhere from $15 to $35, or about $50 to $100 in today's cash. As much as things change, they truly do stay the same. Now, these price points aren't really even comparable to the games that came out before, considering the vast differences in the product and market. The original Odyssey wasn't really appealing to gamers as we know them now, rather enthusiasts in computers and technology, and the following Pong consoles were more of a toy with a high price point. Atari, on the other hand, had a completely different sales model from everything that came before it, with consumers having to buy the game console and additional games afterwards. It was a hard sell, but I feel like most consumers did the math and saw that in the long run, this was cheaper, especially with the games being able to display graphics. Cheaper games were sold for $10, with the higher quality ones being worth up to $31, being worth about 3 times their price in today's cash. This, at the time, was the best deal you could get in gaming. The main competitors at the time could only barely keep up with Atari, selling standard games for about $25, but the Atari brand was big enough and the system itself was supported enough that companies like ColecoVision and Intellivision faded into obscurity after this. And especially after the video game crash of '83, it took a lot to get consumers to pay for these games, especially since the games were... The games of this era were either ass simple or boring and ass simple, and in the rare chance that they tried to be ambitious, they were damn near impossible to make any progress in. All the low quality games broke the consumer's trust, and at the end of the day, a lot of the people into this garbage just realized that there wasn't any point of buying these games because they were available in bars and arcades for 25 cents a pop, and were usually better there. That's one thing a lot of people fail to take into account nowadays: the arcade scene. Almost all of the popular games of this era started life in the arcades, and when they made their way onto consoles months or years later, they were heavily compromised. Just take a look at a game like Donkey Kong in the arcade, now on ColecoVision. Can you spot the difference? Get back to me on that. The reason there was such a holdout from the general public is the fact that paying $120 just to play a game that was only a quarter down the road didn't make any financial sense. And when they weren't arcade games first, they were... The only console that was able to reproduce these games exactly was the Vectrex, and that was both only for monochrome vector games and was ass expensive. That's right, expensive as ass! Of course there were outside aspects, but this is partially why the NES succeeded so much. The games looked almost identical to some of the most popular arcade games of the time for about the same price as the games available on previous consoles. I see the difference! I'm not being scammed by one! Even when the games were expensive, the complexity, exclusivity, and eventual fame of said games made it so that people were willing to drop up to $50 on Wheel of Fortune. That didn't mean there weren't exceptions to the rule. The company Codemasters released the Aladdin Deck Enhancer, an attempt at both saving money in manufacturing and to circumvent Nintendo's limit on the number of games published. This was essentially a cartridge that would come in 2 parts, the actual Deck Enhancer and the game. The Deck Enhancer contained a bit of the technology used in most NES cartridges, with the games themselves containing the rest needed to run that specific game. The games themselves retailed for about $20, but not only did most games planned for the Deck Enhancer never come out, but the ones that did ended up being released as standard NES games, and after the failure of the Deck Enhancer, the other company involved in it, Camerica, ended up going bankrupt. And hey, on the other end of the financial spectrum, we have Action 52. This was a collection of games for the NES retailing at a whopping $200, with the high price point coming from the fact that this NES cartridge came with 52 different games, with an asterisk on every word in that sentence. I'd say a solid 90% of the games in the package are half-assed copies of each other, and the other 10% will make you wish you were playing the 90. The game is barely even functional. Half the time the screen is so garbled you can't tell what's going on, and when I select the game titled GeForce, I better see some damn hamsters. This is around the same time when we saw the explosion of the handheld market, with the obvious frontrunner being Nintendo's Game Boy. Nintendo had experience in the handheld market, with their previous endeavors being with their Game & Watch line, with the games retailing at about $25, about $100 in today's cash. When it came time for them to price the Game Boy games, most first-party games floated around the $30 mark. Most of these games were either direct ports or very comparable to that of games on home consoles at the time. Games were simple enough that the only thing being lost in translation was color, and most games were able to do without that. In addition, these games were full quality games portably, something that was practically a new concept at the time, considering most handheld games were essentially calculators, or Atari still clinging to relevancy. The convenience of portability was worth it to some people, and for others, the Game Boy versions of certain games were the only versions they knew, considering the higher user base of the handheld. Following the NES, we got the 4th gen of consoles, with the big 2 systems being the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. These two were duking it out over everything, including price, with Genesis games being a solid $50 and SNES games usually being closer to $60, though first-party games could be available for closer to $50. Now this was interesting because even though the games on the SNES were often of a higher quality than the Genesis games, the lower price point of Genesis games and the types of games on it were enough to let Sega stand toe-to-toe with Nintendo. That, in addition with Sega's ruthless ad campaign, gave this the edge on Nintendo, and they even overtook them for a while. Enough so that when Action 52 came back with a vengeance, they decided to go to the Genesis this time. What an honor! The conman decided to move into your neighborhood! Of course, Nintendo and Sega weren't the only ones making a ruckus around this time. TurboGrafx 16, anyone?
No thanks.
None of these companies could even keep up with the big guys, and while game prices weren't the only reason they failed, it definitely was a factor. After all, why would you ever buy a $50 game that looks and plays inferior to the other guys? Because it's all I have! Jumping to the next generation with the N64, Sega Saturn, and incoming PlayStation, there was a massive shift in pricing. With the introduction of CDs, game manufacturing got a whole lot cheaper and a whole lot more accessible. You didn't have to be concerned with internal batteries or any additional chips or just the general cost of manufacturing. Sure, piracy was a little easier and people might have to look at a load screen every once in a while, but that being the only drawback for cheaper games on both the manufacturing and purchasing end was a massive win on every front. Anyways, let's check back in with Nintendo. Nintendo's insistence on using cartridges this generation was a disaster for both them and the consumer. On Nintendo's side, it led to developers not wanting to develop for their console, which meant that they had less games to release. And when there was a game released, you had to check your credit score before even thinking of buying them. Early on, the games were priced as high as $60, with some publishers having the gall to go all the way up to $90. After it was clear that Nintendo wasn't going to be making a profit this generation, they eventually had to settle down to Sony's level, offering most games for around $40, though it was still common to find new releases sold for $60 for its entire life. Sega had a similar issue to Nintendo, but as soon as it was clear they were falling behind, they also cut prices. And then there was 3DO. That's all I have to say on 3DO. This is what shaped game pricing going forward. Going into the next generation, most first-party titles for the GameCube, PS2, and Xbox were around $50, with the exception of the Dreamcast. With Sega on their hands and knees begging for anyone to buy their games before giving up, trying to make Xbox backwards compatible with the Dreamcast, then becoming a third-party developer. Game costs jumped an additional $10 with the jump to HD. This is also where we saw indies get their foot in the door with Xbox Live and WiiWare, with most indie games being priced around $20 at the time. The $60 price point remained for a good decade and a half, even as development studios kept ballooning in employees and games got more and more complex. This is partially why so many games were considered flops late into the PS4, Xbox One, and well into the Switch's lives. Games had so much money poured into them that if they didn't receive an absurd amount of sales, they were deemed failures. Crash Bandicoot 4, It's About Time sold over 5 million copies, but the team was still told the game was a flop. Same case with Hi-Fi Rush, Resident Evil 7, Tomb Raider 2013 sold 3 million in its first week and was still considered a failure. This is half the reason Nintendo remains successful despite the fact that they aren't the leaders in gaming tech anymore. They're able to make games smaller in scope with smaller dev teams so that when a game ends up being a flop, they can eat the cost, and when a game succeeds, they rake in much more profits than the other companies. I only briefly touched on it earlier, but that's also why portable games are so profitable. They were being sold at half the price of the home consoles games, yet were more financially successful and sold better than that of the larger games. There was also the advent of free-to-play games during this generation, and that destroyed how these companies thought about games and pricing. Fortnite, Overwatch, PUBG, League of Legends, Team Fortress 2, and more recently, Marvel Rivals are all massive hits that, despite being available to everyone with an internet connection, managed to rake in billions every year. They make money through overpriced in-game cosmetics and taunts, and this led to a whole slew of anti-consumer practices. I love Marvel Rivals and TF2, but even I have to admit that the amount of real-world money these games want me to spend on costumes is absolutely ludicrous. And then we get to the PS5. You know, developing for 4K with such high-quality titles was eventually gonna catch up to the consumer price-wise, but that didn't make Sony embracing the $70 price point any less jarring. I feel like the general consumer isn't as stingy as most people think. If it's worth it, people are usually okay with dropping a stack on a true innovation or even pure quality. The problem with Sony embracing it with the PS5 is that for the majority majority of its life, the games being released were either just not appealing to anyone outside of graphic freaks, or games that were remakes of PS4 games that cost $10 more than the original game, which were $10 more than the PS3 version. There was even more confusion that when Astrobot was released, it was at the standard $60. The game was more graphically intensive and more critically acclaimed than most games on the system, but aside from the relatively smaller team behind the game, there was no real reason for this game to be cheaper than this game. The other two major platforms at the time were relatively hesitant. Xbox's ecosystem since the launch of Game Pass has always been a bit strange. Most of the people using that system weren't even buying their games, instead just subscribing to play whatever Xbox threw at them. Now Nintendo likes money. While other games would usually drop in price after a year, Nintendo's never did. On top of that, their games, regardless of quality, always launched at $60, and the few that did launch below that, what, did they need lunch money that day or something? The one time that they did charge a full $70, it was both surprising and made the most sense in the world. Tears of the Kingdom had an insane development time, was a massive game, and was the most anticipated Nintendo game since the console's launch. It was also the only game that Nintendo ended up charging this much on, so it was perceived as the exception rather than the norm. And then the Switch 2 Direct happened. This Direct was insane! A new 3D Donkey Kong made by the Odyssey devs, a sequel to Kirby Air Ride made by Sakurai himself, an open world Mario Kart with the largest roster known to man. This was looking to be the most stacked console launch of all time, but immediately after the Direct, information on the console started to be released. First, the price on the console in America being $450, a bit pricey compared to the original Switch, but understandable considering how intense the games announced seemed to be. But then the game prices came out. It was a really big lunch. To be fair, there was a lot of misreporting going on. I saw reports of games being up to $100 digital floating around, but the true prices weren't much better, with Donkey Kong going for $70, Mario Kart $80, and hey, if you really like those misreported prices, you could always move to Canada. I have never been more happy and more embarrassed to live in Tennessee. All hype for the Switch 2 screeched to a halt in only an hour, and that should show you just how important the pricing of these games is to their success. Hell, even the tech demo that just tells you why you even bought the console is going for $6. At that point, why even charge for it? Just include that with the console. Even then, we don't know if these are the final prices for the games. Every time I cough, it seems like the price changes to the point that Nintendo had to delay pre-orders because even they don't know what the price is gonna be. This is my perspective in early 2025, where massive import taxes are being signed in and out of existence nearly every time I blink. So who knows how much Switch 2 games are going to end up costing, but it's clear that gaming is about to get a lot more expensive. Most Switch 1 and 2 cartridges are manufactured in Taiwan, and the physical versions of Xbox and PlayStation games are often printed in Mexico. Regardless of the political events that will affect the price, it's entirely possible that the physical game could just disappear entirely due to how the markets are shifting. The Switch 2 is being shipped with more storage than ever. It's common for consoles to exist without a disc drive, and the popularity of handhelds like the Steam Deck are definitely something that the industry is keeping its eye on. Publishers and the platforms also like digital games more than physical ones. With the physical game, they have to spend money to ship the games to stores, and not all the money goes directly back to the developers of the game, whereas a digital store means that you can change the price of a game on a whim, and the only other party getting your money is the one who owns the digital storefront. It also means your game won't end up at a second-hand store where you receive none of the profits, meaning if somebody wants to play the game, they have to buy it for whatever price the company lists it as. Video games are expensive to make and take so many people, all of which are entitled to compensation for the work on these pieces of art. Some of these games can take days to just complete, and some of the biggest franchises of all time are video games first. On top of that, shouldn't we ensure that these pieces of art continue to maintain their quality rather than slowly shriveling up due to lack of funds? No. That's not our job as the consumer. If you can't afford a game, or even if a game just doesn't seem worth it for the price at launch, don't buy it! Is the easy thing to say. Online games like Kirby's Dream Buffet or Fall Guys thrive off of having people to play against, and if you don't act fast, the user base will either be so in tune with the game's mechanics that it's impossible to compete with them, or worse, the game won't have any players to play the game with. What about games with massive communities? The second the game comes out, day one buyers will be discussing it online and possibly spoil the game for you. The important lesson to take from all of this is to ask yourself what you individually value in a game. I'm gonna buy Mario Kart World at launch because the game looks stellar and I want to be able to play it with my family. But if you aren't able to drop a mortgage on it, that's okay. The game will still be there for you when it eventually goes on sale, or even years down the line when you can buy it secondhand. That's another thing to remember. The previous generations of games also exist and are not nearly as archaic as people make them out to be. There is a reason that AAA studios rely so much on remakes these days, and that's because these classics still hold up. Gaming, despite being a relatively young art form, has so many fantastic games for dirt cheap on previous consoles. This is actually closer to the games market in many other countries due to heavy import tax. The Master System, a system with very little market impact in the West, had an outstanding shelf life in countries like Brazil and South Korea, where it was only recently discontinued. Neo Geo barely existed outside of the arcade in America, but in places like Mexico and Latin America, it had a much larger impact for the same reason. Finally, be open to playing more low-budget and indie games. Sure, they will never have the level of grandiose that a AAA release will have, but games like Mosalina, Anton Blast, and Ina Dream Barbecue, on top of dozens more, have impacted me so much more than almost any AAA game I've ever played. When I dump my college savings into the Switch 2, I'm not going to be playing the massive games made by Nintendo first. I'm gonna play Deltarune. I'm extremely interested in modern releases, but I save my money only for the games I know I can afford, and I'm willing to drop insane amounts of money to play early. There's maybe 3 to 4 modern releases I'll pick up in a year, but in the meantime I buy for the cheapest consoles. PlayStation 2, NES, and even Game Boy. Not only are these games going for dirt cheap at local game stores, but for the most part, are quality. And if you really don't have the money to buy Larry Boy on the PS2, most games are available elsewhere if you just know how to look. That being said, there are a few stragglers I didn't get around to earlier because it didn't really make sense, so you know what that means. That's right, it's time for the Big Deuce Lightning Round! The SG-1000 was Sega's first console ever released, being able to play both ColecoVision games and its own original games, with the original ones being around $20 each. The Atari 7800 wasn't far after, with the games being anywhere from $20 to $30. This would be a pretty good deal if these games were the same damn games people bought all the way back on the 5200, which were the same as the 2600 games, but those are also playable on the 7800 for half the price. Do you see why Atari lost all their relevancy past the 90s? The TurboGrafx 16.
No thanks.
The 16 was sort of a half step between the NES and the SNES. If it wasn't for Sega's ruthless ad campaign, they might have done a bit better considering the games were about $16 and were definitely quality. The Philips CDI was garbage. The games were at a cheaper $30, but were also CDI games. Do I have to explain to you why this didn't do well? The Genesis had a myriad of tumors you could attach to it, with the 32X games having a bit more garbage in them and the CD games being cheaper to manufacture. At the end of the day, the 32X games were a whopping $150 at launch, the Sega CD games were a solid $50, and both were massive failures. Neo Geo games launched at $250. I never want to hear someone question why Terry Bogard isn't popular in the West. Virtual Boy games were $40. Do you guys think the console did well? The Atari Jaguar was Atari's final attempt at the console market, with them being the first ones to the 4th gen of consoles, with the games being a smooth $30. However, it was an Atari console, so not only did nobody buy the games, but they were also lame as hell! 3DO! No! Finally, there's the Intellivision Amico. I sense that somewhere somebody's mother is very proud. While many are aware of the face behind the console, Tommy Tallarico, and the shenanigans he's been involved in, not many are aware you can purchase the games for the console. Before the console's even released. $250 is the cost for 8 physical Amico games, and you can't even play them! Plus, they're NFTs somehow? In 2025? And if you wanted to pay $250 for a group of terrible games, I might have the game for you. I'm not exactly thrilled that video games are becoming more expensive, but hey, maybe I'll be one of the first people out there to experience one of the biggest and most innovative games in the entire industry! They repossessed my house. That's a terrible... God, I am so white.